The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 27. The time is now. Lydia says goodbye and hello, and 7 remembers. The snowbank was blinding. Yellow and white sparkles exploded in tiny puffs that Tweety tried to follow with her eyes. Sparkles were on the very top of the snowbank, floating out of the snow beneath like feathers. And with all that swirling, she could hardly see the snowbank beneath, which sat there like a huge white animal. Tweety eyed it suspiciously to see if it might be dangerous. Besides this, though, her bottom was wet inside and out. It was sloppy and wiggly, and on the inside by her underpants where the familiar brown, warm, smelly stuff came out. It squashed when she plopped down on the ground, and she could feel it squishing beneath her legs. But the wet outside her bottom stuck to the snow, and when she sat in the snow, it was cold and hard. Her face burned with the sunlight, and burned. Cold, too. And still she sat there in the snow, where suddenly she'd fallen. She didn't hurt, but she stung. She started to wonder exactly where she stung, and whether or not it was worthwhile to start crying about it. But she kept getting fascinated by the yellow-white shining snow sparkles that flew out of the snowbank glittering in the sun. She stared at them, feeling dreamy. But then the cat caught her eye. He was rounding the shed house. Then she remembered that she'd just fallen down and that she wanted to follow the cat. "Get up, me," she said to herself mentally, because physically she couldn't get the words out right, though they sounded all right inside. Getting the outside like the inside was hard. The cat dashed out into the sunlight again, a blur of activity. Impatient, Tweety tried to get up again, but nothing happened. There was something that the other her told her to do at such times. But what? Then it happened all by itself. She saw herself get up quite clearly and chase the cat. The picture of herself flashed right out in front of her eyes, and before she realized what had happened, she was up on her feet, following the image of herself. Only then it disappeared, and there was only the cat. For one instant, before it vanished, she was the image of the self she followed. And she saw it, herself, in her brown leggings and coat, and bundled up in the hateful orange scarf, running. But she wasn't running really, just plodding. She couldn't go fast enough yet, and the snow kept rushing up to meet her, and it hurt when it hit her on the bottom. No, she thought, the snow didn't come up at her after all. She kept falling down to meet it. Then she was down again, harder than ever, plopped on her wet bottom, which really stung. She yowled. Nobody came get her up. No inside people or outside people. She got scared. The wind came up and whipped about her. She flailed back at it, but it didn't stop. The sun became brighter, so that the snow sparkles glittered all over, and she could hardly see. Tweety shouted angrily at the wind, which now was blowing snow in her face. "Up me," she said to herself. "You have to make the picture first," said the other her, somewhere in her head, and Tweety brightened, not feeling quite so lonesome. She had to make the picture first. That's how it was done. So she wiggled her forehead and thought about it and tried, but with no success. "I guess I'll have to do it for you again," Lydia said, and she projected a mental image of Tweety so that Tweety could see herself what her body was supposed to be doing. Tweety saw herself get up and walk into the house. So she got up and followed the image, booted feet against the crisp snow. The sun went beneath some clouds and Tweety stopped, astonished. Where had the brightness gone? Why was the air darker and colder, and she'd lost a mitten? The snow had changed too. Now it was all dark blue or worse, like upside-down clouds on a thunder day. She shivered. The dark part of the air felt prickly, as if it had tiny prickers in it from air bushes she couldn't see. She thrust her pudgy hand out and started giggling. The air stung like the cat's tongue did sometimes when it flicked her fingers. Oh God, Lydia thought, how incredibly rich Tweety's world was. How much sense data had she explored in the 5 minutes or so that they'd been in the yard? Bianca never left Tweety out over 15 minutes at most, and always watched from the window. A fact Lydia kept in mind, but Tweety usually forgot in the brilliance of present existence. Lydia wanted to cry with nostalgia, and joy too. Feeling it all from Tweety's viewpoint was still shockingly immediate, while she herself had almost forgotten the first explorations of, well, life and creaturehood. A part of Lydia's consciousness stayed with Tweety, and a part disassociated and looked down on Tweety as the child plodded through the snow. Lydia knew the house was only a few feet away, yet through the child's experience it seemed much more distant. And that 17th century landscape, Lydia thought. It was so dear, so lost in time, yet never lost, of course, because it was somehow or other a different now. Tweety's now, ever opening up to her senses. What difference if this was all passed from a 20th century viewpoint? She had to learn to readjust her thinking, because obviously all time existed at once. No matter how much there might be that she didn't understand, how heroic, how forever meaningful and unique was that one child's wonder in the moment of its now. Then why did she want to cry? She knew the answer. She was caught between her own experience and Tweety's. More and more she was drawn to the bright new focus of Tweety's life. Yet if she gave in, she'd lose her own identity and be swept away, at least into momentary oblivion. She'd lose her own freedom, she thought. Yet what did that freedom mean to her? If it locked her out of the incomparable creaturehood focus of one space, one time. So, watching Tweety and feeling with and through Tweety, Lydia realized that she herself felt homeless between dimensions, and yet unwilling to give up her freedom. And all the while she felt Tweety become more greedily alive, growing fuller and more magnificent in flesh. OverSoul 7 experienced Lydia's and Tweety's feelings at the same time, and he'd been trying to get through to Lydia since Tweety first fell down in the snow. Only Lydia had been too distracted to listen. "Lydia," he said, "you have to enter fully into your experience, which is Tweety's. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. Look at the backyard as Tweety does, with wonder, and your wonder will lead you to where you want to go." But Tweety had made it to the door. Bianca let her in, and now Tweety sat inside by the wood stove, where the hot breath of the fire rushed out at her when Bianca opened the oven door to keep her daughter warm as she took off her wet clothes. Lydia, exhausted, found herself as fascinated and frightened by the fire as Tweety was, and she tried to hold on and not lose herself in the heat of Tweety's intense concentration. Tweety felt heavy, bulky, and unpredictable. Bianca said, "Now, we'll take your leggings off." "Look, sweetheart," Joseph said. His voice, always loud, thundered in Tweety's ears. She started to scowl, but Joseph held out a piece of bread and jam, and even if it was loud, his voice was yellow and warm and heavy like honey. "You're trying to bribe her for a kiss," Bianca said. "You bribed me," Joseph answered, grinning. "And not with bread and jam either. Stop it now. This isn't the time," Bianca said, blushing and partly angry because sometimes he just knew too much when you don't want him to. While Bianca and Joseph laughed, and Tweety began chattering agreeably enough as her snow clothes were removed, Lydia nearly panicked. She'd forgotten herself again, hypnotized by the domestic scene, the warm kitchen, the adults. The adults! Oh God, she'd done it again, she'd realized, falling naturally into Tweety's psychological world. "That is the idea, after all," OverSoul 7 said, finally getting through to her. "I've been trying to talk to you. It's time now." "It's time now? For what?" Lydia asked mentally. Then she thought, of course, it really was time. Tweety's clothes were off now. Bianca was rubbing her skin with a towel that had been heated in the oven. The pleasant sensations made Tweety squeal. "It's time to forget, just for a while," 7 said. "Time to give your new self a chance. You've helped Tweety all you can for now." "Papa's little darling," Joseph exclaimed, coming nearer, with his big face close to hers, brown mustache bristling. Lydia felt all life calling. The wood in the stove crackled, it seemed, as no other kindling wood ever had. Joseph gave Tweety the bread and jam, and the texture and the taste was brand new in the universe, a sensual wonder. All life and reality suddenly seemed concentrated in the warm, immediate kitchen. Inside herself, Lydia sobbed. with nostalgia for the future and the past. "I'll be with you," OverSoul 7 said. It was a point of light on the windowpane. Mentally, Lydia muttered, "A lot of good that will do. I'll forget you too, won't I?" "She looks like you, Bianca," Joseph's voice warmly thundered. He stared, grinning, into Tweety's face. And Lydia for a moment stared back. She thought that he'd already forgotten that they had chosen to be father and daughter, that... "How strange she looks sometimes," Bianca cried, worried. And Lydia looked out of the child's eyes, through the unsteamed portion of the kitchen window, seeing the 17th century fields covered with snow, the past come alive and turning into the present. "But it isn't the past, of course," OverSoul 7 said, "and I'm so proud of you." "The time is now, isn't it?" she said. "I wish there was some way that you could give Tweety some of the knowledge that I've picked up along the way, or the knowledge that you've picked up. Like a built-in set of instructions, or..." She paused, dizzy. She could feel herself becoming Tweety even more completely. It was difficult to concentrate. "7, it will be all right, won't it?" she called, for OverSoul 7 seemed to be disappearing into a kind of psychological distance, while she, as Tweety impatiently wiggled as Bianca dressed her in warm clothes. "It will be fine," 7 called back. "I promise. And I promise that I'll give Tweety some kind of instruction book for a new life. And what you've learned will be a part of her heritage too." In his pride in Lydia and his desire to help her, in his exuberance, 7 shouted, "I'll think of something terrific." Bianca stared. "Tweety looks different now. Look at her." She wiped her hands on her apron and looked closely into Tweety's face. "She seems more here," she cried. "More where?" Joseph laughed. "She's She's my girl. She's more here now," Bianca muttered to herself. She stood watching as Joseph swung Tweety over his shoulders, and singing a ballad carried her into the other room. "It will be just fine, dear Lydia," 7 whispered. "Whee!" cried Tweety. OverSoul 7 felt like crying. He felt like laughing. "Goodbye for a while, dear Lydia. And hello, dear Tweety," he said. But 7 suddenly felt himself being drawn away. Something was happening, some important psychological readjustment. Before he could wonder about it, 7 found himself back with Cypress. Geoffrey and Ram still sat talking and sipping drinks. "No time has passed here," Cypress said. "But Lydia's forgetting is letting Geoffrey..." "Remember," OverSoul 7 finished. "Of course." "What is it?" Ram asked, leaping to his feet. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Maybe a figurative one," Geoffrey said mysteriously. "No, I'm all right. I just remembered something, though. Now it seems impossible that I'd ever forgotten it." Then irritably, "And stop looking at me with that fake, kind old psychologist smile, will you?" Yes, all right," Ram said, unoffended. "You may or may not know that my middle initial is W for William," Geoffrey said. He stood up almost groggily. It was hard for him to talk. "Well, just now, just this minute, mind you, I remembered that I used to identify myself as Will for, I don't know, several years. I even signed my name as William, not Geoffrey. This was at a time when I was feeling quite despondent, really. Yet for years all that slipped from my mind. Only earlier today I remembered what shall I call it, almost suicide attempt. One day I played around with the idea anyway, standing dangerously close to a cliff edge, and I never was sure what happened, a lapse of memory, but I didn't jump, and I just this moment remembered. After that day I never thought of myself as Will again, and until now I'd completely forgotten that I ever had. "You'd better sit down," Ram said anxiously. But Geoffrey paced the floor excitedly, calling over his shoulder, "But that was a kind of psychic suicide, wasn't it?" "I suppose it could be called that," Ram said cautiously. "You know damn well it could," Geoffrey said. He was so agitated that Ram patted him on the shoulder, but Geoffrey pulled away. "I don't need any sympathy now," he said suddenly, as I remembered the name thing. "I had the oddest feeling. I feel more here, more me, as if I've resurrected portions of myself. Suddenly you make me feel quite envious," Ram said. "I could have written your book when I was your age, or my version of it. But I didn't, of course." "I didn't say I had a book," Geoffrey exclaimed. "My first guess was a scientific treatise of some sort," Ram said, as if he hadn't been interrupted. "But afterward I realized that a different kind of manuscript must have been involved. In any case, I had my chance and muffed it. But now it's almost as if I went back in time and changed a version of me by helping you." "I'm not any version of you," Geoffrey shouted. "Of course you're not. You're too literal-minded," Ram said. "Still, your future will be more like the future I might have had." OverSoul 7 was having difficulties following the conversation. For one thing, he was losing his focus on Earth time, so that objects appeared and disappeared according to when they had existed or would exist in any given space, and particularly in the space that was Geoffrey's living room. He heard Geoffrey's voice, but sometimes it was speaking yesterday, sometimes tomorrow, and OverSoul 7 couldn't find a proper present at all. Beside him, Cypress waited. "You're too far to the left of today," she said. 7 called somewhat anxiously, "I can't seem to find any today to start with." "Any time is a present time if you're there. Stop where things seem to be right now and call that today." "All right, if you say so," 7 whispered. "But now it's a different present than it was before. I got confused, or I get confused. I mean, you're in a different present time than I am." "No matter," she said. "I'm on a platform above time, and theoretically you should be, too, but tell me when you are. I am to the left of time from your viewpoint? I think, came Seven's hasty reply. All right, that's Jeffrey's past. Now back up a bit further. Seven was growing dizzy. Chairs and tables changed their positions according to their locations at any given time. Jeffrey's figure appeared at the window, then at the door. Ram disappeared entirely. The living room flickered bright, then dark, as nights and days flashed by. Now, Cypress directed. Seven tried to stop things as quickly as he could. Then he grinned. It was Jeffrey's room at night. Before what? For he saw himself and Cypress, both in adult male images, out on Jeffrey's patio. That image suits me rather well, he said to the Cypress on the platform above time. Shh, listen and watch, she said. I think I have it all straight, said the earlier image of Seven, who stood with the male Cypress. All what straight? Asked the present Seven. Will you just listen? Said the Cypress out of time, while the Cypress of the past, standing with the past Seven, said, I think you're very wise. After tonight, you'll completely forget that Jeffrey is one of your personalities living in time. That way, you can look at him more objectively, since you seem to be having trouble relating to him properly. So that's it, shouted the present Seven, and suddenly it all came back to him. Just as the past Seven said, Right, I agree, will both appear to him in his dream state and cleverly lead him out of the depression he's been in since his wife left him. Some psychologist, he doesn't even recognize his own depression. Cypress on the platform above time said, and Lydia and Jeffrey can help each other, as each looks for a meaning to existence. And the past Seven cried, and will stimulate Jeffrey's creative abilities, which he's buried for so long, and re-arouse the young Will with all the dissatisfactions he feels, so that Jeffrey can recognize them and deal with his problems. Exactly, both Cypresses said. While Lydia rediscovers the joy of Earth life, also helping Jeffrey revive his own love of life. Exactly, both Cypresses replied. And as both Cypresses and both Sevens spoke at and as both Cypresses and both Sevens spoke at once, time thickened. Jeffrey's living room had two levels of time simultaneously. In one, the earlier Cypress and Seven in the male images were just entering the room from the patio and arousing Jeffrey as he lay on the couch. The wind tugged at the geranium pot on the patio, which would shortly fall over, alarming Jeffrey. In the second level of time, in their present, Ram and Jeffrey still sat talking. Yes, Ram was saying. I could almost have done an automatic manuscript myself, and someday you'll have to show me yours. Do you feel that we aren't alone? Jeffrey asked suddenly. Ram smiled and shrugged. I've been staring at the ceiling all the time we've been talking, drawn to it. See those two lights up there by the corner? Reflections most likely, but Geoffrey looked. At the same time, though, he saw nothing extraordinary. He felt an extraordinary yearning that made him say, "Do you believe in the soul? I mean, as a psychological entity?" And as Geoffrey asked the question, in time's vast depth, Tweedy looked out the window of her childhood room at the stars, and thought that the starlight formed a familiar yet strange image, as if looking out she was looking inside her own mind. And in the vast reaches of Geoffrey's consciousness, Will walked up mental steps to the threshold of Geoffrey's growing understanding. Ram said comfortably, "More to the point, since you asked, do you?" "I believe in something," Geoffrey said. "But there's some writing I have to do just now. I don't mean to cut our conversation short, but there's something I must finish." "I thought there might be," Ram said. Then Geoffrey wrote this chapter and the previous one. He wrote all night. No longer astonished at his own experience, wound through the narrative and was reshaped, turned endwise and sidewards, focused and unfocused, and yet more than his and Will's. And then, after a brief sleep, he continued. In chapter 27, peace, light, and love, aloha.